Hi everyone. So we'll be starting this event. So firstly, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and also obviously thank you, Zanny, for your time and for taking time to come here. And she hardly needs an introduction. I mean, we all know that she's the editor-in-chief of The Economist. But just to elaborate a little bit more, she is actually the first woman to hold this role in the publication's 180-year history. And also, before joining The Economist, Zanny has also been at the International Monetary Fund and also has worked in emerging markets in The Economist. And under her leadership, The Economist continues to be one of the most respected voices in global journalism. So now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Zanny Minton Beddoes. And before moving on, just so you know, after the questions that I'll be asking Zanny, there will be an open Q&A session. So if you have any burning questions, you can ask it then. So Zanny, now we'll start with a few questions about your career. So my first question is, have you ever faced conflicts between journalistic integrity and personal or organizational values? And if so, how have you navigated?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's very nice to see so many of you here. It's very nice to see someone with a physical copy of The Economist, which I see you've just hidden under the people. That's very impressive. Thank you. The honest answer is I haven't. But I think that's probably because the only place I've ever worked is The Economist as a journalist. And it's not only are The Economist's values that it's championed for 180 odd years very close to my own. I'm a kind of dyed-to-the-wool liberal with a small L. I believe in free markets, I believe in open societies, I believe in traditional classical liberal values. So that doesn't mean there's never been a single point that we've made somewhere that I might put differently or disagree with. I've had disagreements, but I've never had any kind of tension between my own values and those of The Economist. And I've also, The Economist places great premium on being fair-minded and rigorous and authoritative. And that's certainly what I always try to do. I'm not sure I've always lived up to it, but it's what I've always tried to do. So there's never ever been a case where I've been, even in my early days, because I was never asked to write something that I didn't believe in. The approach has always been, go and do an analysis and take the argument where the facts lead you. So it sounds. I wish I could say, oh yes, there was a terrible incident on recount the tale, but it genuinely hasn't. I mean, I've made mistakes. One which I sort of shudder in embarrassment for forever is that I wrote a piece when I first joined. My first job was to be emerging markets correspondent, because that's what I was doing at the IMF. And then I wrote a piece about countries that had defaulted. And I just don't know how I did it. But anyway, in a terrible error, which wasn't picked up by our very, very good fact-checking department, I included in the list of countries that had defaulted Romania, which hasn't defaulted at all. And I caused a sort of short mini crisis in Romania, and I was furious. This was in the days before sort of fax machine days, but it was incredibly embarrassing. I was like, oh my god, I can't believe I did that. And I definitely made other mistakes like that. But I've never written anything that I don't believe in. I've changed my mind on things. I've learned, and I think the previous positions I had were wrong, but never have I had to say, my conscience is telling me X, but I'm writing Y. And I don't think I ever would, actually. I think that I would find it very, very difficult to do that. And I'd like to think that I would leave an organisation that required me to write something that I didn't believe in. But that said, it's interesting. There are lots of people. The Economist is not a monolith of people who all have identical views. One of the reasons it's such an interesting place to work is that there are people with different political and ideological views within The Economist. And so there are plenty of people who don't agree with everything that our leader lies have, for example. And I think that's a sort of, a decision that you make when you join The Economist. If you probably won't agree with every single leader. Right now, I agree with every leader line because I in the end get to decide whether we like leaders or not. But previously, that wasn't always the case. And what I think the reason people are prepared to do that is that our editorials are the result of a long period of debate to which everybody contributes. And so I think even people who, in the end, don't agree with an editorial judgment feel that their voice has been heard and feel that they've had an ability to contribute to the debate, and the leaders are always the better for the criticisms that come from people who don't agree with them. And even, there are plenty of subjects right now that are very, very divisive. I need hardly mention them, but, events in Gaza being an obvious one, where there are very, very clearly different views, different gradations of views, and not everyone agrees with everything that we have written. But I hope that we have been able to create an environment where we can have robust discussion, and where I'm very, very sure that what we write is made better by the comments and criticisms of people who don't agree with it.
Thank you so much for that response, Zanny. And I would like to say it's really amazing that you can work for an organization that aligns with your values so totally. And I'll move on to my next question, which is, what do you think makes a good economic journalist?
Economic journalist. I hope you're all thinking of becoming an economic journalist. I think, I'm going to say three things. The first is true of all journalism, that curiosity is essential to being a journalist. You have to be curious. You have to want to ask why. You have to want to talk to people to understand why. You have to want to try to seek out all sides of a debate, whether it's a policy debate or something. So that's the slightly pat answer, but it's really essential. The second, and I think this is really important in economics, and as I hope music to at least some of your ears, I think it is really important to have had some training in economics. There are plenty of journalists who write about economics who have no training in economics, but I think you could really tell. And the reasons are that you need to be able to have the confidence to assess what you're being told by policymakers or market participants or indeed academics. And I think that's really hard to do if you have zero background in economics. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have a PhD. I don't have a PhD. But you do have to have some formal training, I think, in economics. It's much easier. You are a much better economic journalist if you have some formal training. And similarly, and this obviously goes alongside it, to be somewhat quantitative. Because the difference in a sort of piece of economic journalism, if you can run your own numbers, if you can, it doesn't, I'm not suggesting you make some sort of super complicated model, but just simply to be able to do some basic number crunching of your own, or indeed to be able to assess an academic paper, to be able to kind of read it critically. I think that's really important, and it really distinguishes people who are, and there are many, who are sort of generalist journalists who happen to write about economics, and really good economic journalists. So our economics team, everybody there has at least a master's in economics. And increasingly, I mean, this is also I'm a sort of dinosaur trained in the pre-Python age, but there's a real sort of somewhat conversant with Python. Like, I'm certainly nowhere as good as I'm sure any of you are. But I think that the ability to work then with we have a sort of full-time data journalist team who that's all they do. And then sometimes the best stuff is a collaboration between an economics journalist and a data scientist. And you can just do amazing stuff nowadays. And that, I think, is very much the direction of much journalism, that in a world of AI, simple information is ubiquitous. So it is really about going out, finding new stuff out, synthesizing things, using different sources, bringing them together, really looking at different angles. And I think there to have the critical confidence that comes from some economics training with the quantitative ability, that makes for a very powerful combination. And then I think the third part is that you have to be interested in engaging and interacting with people. Because in the end, journalism is not like academia. In academia, you do your own research in a relatively narrow area. If you make it your career, right, that's what you focus on. One, you write your PhD, you write your several papers in one quite narrow area. The great thing about journalism, but I think is why many academics would find it sort of incredibly trying, is that you have to be comfortable with very quickly getting to grips with a subject about which you know nothing, and then writing with great confidence about it. And so I find that to be very exciting, and I get a big sort of adrenaline rush from thinking, okay, I know absolutely nothing about subject X. But you know, in a week, or I don't write that much anymore, but when I used to write, you know, X subject comes up, in a few days' time, you're supposed to be a great expert on it. And you have license to go and call up anybody, email anybody, harness, you know, information from anywhere, but you have to be sort of comfortable with the kind of brazen, you know, I guess there's a brazen arrogance that comes from thinking, I can understand what this is about and write something interesting on it in a very short period of time. And that's if you find that really frustrating, if you're someone, and this is, I don't mean this in any pejorative sense, but some people need a lot of time to really dive deeply into something before they're comfortable synthesizing it or having a view on it. And if you're that kind of a person, then journalism is not for you. If you're more of a magpie who is just interested and curious about lots of things and comfortable quickly getting to grips with something, then it's absolutely, it's a wonderful career.
Thank you for your insightful response, Danny. And just to get a sense of the crowd, I would just like to ask, like, raise your hand if you've ever been interested in economic journalism as a career.
Excellent.
Okay, great.
Good.
So my next question is a bit more specific to the current stage we're in, which is like students. So I was just wondering, are there any sort of extracurricular activities you would suggest for us to participate in school? Of course, aside from reading the Economist every day.
You know, there's lots of things you can do. I think, you know, people who are interested in the world around them, and you can manifest that in lots of ways, societies, you know, all kinds of ways you can get involved. I think that's something that we would look for. I think relevant internships are really useful, and just a little bit of promo. We have economics internships, the Marjorie Dean Foundation, which they're called Marjorie Dean internships, you can look them up, which are a formal program that we have for finance and economics interns. And our internships are not, by the way, you know, going to make coffee, they are writing articles. The interns are members of the team from the get-go. And that gives you a very real sense of what it's about. In fact, our current Marjorie Dean intern wrote an editorial and a long piece in her second week, so it's very much actually doing the work. So do those kind of internships. But the other is, and actually something I should have said earlier, you can go straight from graduate or undergraduate work to being a journalist. But I actually think that it is, and maybe I'm just talking my own book because I did something else first, but I think it is helpful, not essential, but helpful to go and do something else first. Whether it's, you know, working in finance, whether it's working in development, whether it's working in, you know, something other than journalism. Because I think you come to journalism with a sense of an experience of professional life and of the world, which can only help. So I've always, when people occasionally ask me for advice, I always say, go off and do something else first. Unless you happen to, you know, get a job offer from a great, you know, journalistic publication, then you should obviously grab it. But it is perfectly possible, and quite often we hire people who do something else first for a few years. You know, and our science writers, similarly, all have graduate degrees and some have worked as research, you know, done research programs or something for a bit first. So don't feel that journalism is something that you have to decide you do straight away. You can always move sideways. And it's probably easier to do that than it is the other way. I think because, not least because most people once they start becoming journalists, they think, why would I ever want to do anything else? Because it's just so fun. And I genuinely can't believe that people pay me to do what I'm doing. I get to, you know, free license to get get in touch with the most interesting people in the world. And I think Economist is a very good calling card that you can focus on something you think is interesting. You have access to the most interesting people, and you get to figure out what you think about it and write about it. And it's an extraordinary luxury. So I think even now, there's a lot of talk about journalism being in a difficult position, and yes, it is. As an industry, there's a lot of change happening, and in a world of generative AI, it's going to change even more. But I think there's still going to be demand for high quality, thoughtful journalism. You may not be writing articles, you may be making videos, you may be making all manner of other things. You may be feeding your insights into an LLM, which will then create a chatbot version of you. There may be all kinds of new ways in which you deliver the insights, but the basic task of what we do, I think, will still be there.
Just picking up on one of your comments about generative AI, I would just like to ask, how has this advent of AI already impacted the economists? How do you think of it?
So I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and we're doing a bunch of things. And I have about last year I created a new role called, what's it called? Senior Editor of AI Initiatives, who is a colleague of mine who's been thinking about and writing about tech for the last 30 years, who is sort of leading our editorial team. But we've been doing a bunch of experiments, both using AI to increase the reach of our content. We're doing a bunch of experiments to improve our own productivity, and a bunch of experiments to sort of think about what the world is like in 2, 3, 4 years' time. But the bottom line is everything that you read, watch, or listen to The Economist is created by humans unless we tell you otherwise. And so what we've been doing, I don't know if any of you read our Espresso app, but Espresso is now free for students. It's our short form app, and it's become our sort of sandbox for experimentation. So Espresso is now available in 4 languages, which we launched 2 months ago. And that was a big project to work out who to partner with. It's AI-generated translation. We trained it using native speakers internally. So we said we wouldn't launch it unless we had 95% fidelity and no serious mistakes. So we could live with some small ones, but no serious ones. So we had a whole program for training. And that actually works really pretty well. We partner with a company called HeyGen to create translations of some of our videos, which are on social channels. So we have Economist Espanol on Instagram, and we translate some into that. And it's really amazing AI translation that the lips move to, and you hear me, and it's very discombobulating. You hear your own voice in a different language because it sounds like me, but it's a different language. So we're doing that. We are using for the weekly Economist is still read by actors, but there's plenty of content we publish that is not in the weekly. We're now starting to use AI text to voice to make sure that, again, it's reach broadening so that more people can listen. Lots and lots of people listen to The Economist. We're experimenting with summarization, so we may well have, and we're doing it we're testing it now, but we're going to have ways in which you can access summarized versions of our content. So the obvious thing is summaries at the top of an article, but we're also thinking of things like newsletters that allow you to catch up in topic areas, things you might have missed if you haven't read The Economist for a couple of weeks, summarize everything about Africa that I missed. So there's lots of very creative ways in which you can use the technology. So this is all sort of things to extend reach and to switch between mediums. For our own productivity, our data team all use Copilot. The graphics team use Midjourney and other programs not to design the covers, but to help with idea generation. We're developing quite a lot of bespoke on top of our own content LLM applications that will, for example, we've got a Slack extension that is a kind of style guide chatbot. So you can interrogate this. It's been trained on our style guide, and you say, is this article have any Americanisms, or what's our style on X? And it's like a kind of interactive chatbot, but based on the Economist style guide. So we're doing lots of things like that. And then the kind of stuff that is still very much at the kind of early stages, we're really thinking hard about. In a world, which I'm not sure how quickly this world comes, but in a world where we all interact with our chatbot first thing in the morning, and it gives us automatically a download of what we might be interested in that's happening in the world. And we no longer, pick up or go to a news site. What then is, what should economist journalism be to induce you to pay a subscription and come to our app? What do we have to provide that the chatbot can't provide? Because I don't think having our content ingested by a chatbot and then at the bottom it says, thanks to the Economist really cuts it. Because I don't know about you, but when I use ChatGPT, I never really notice what it says at the bottom, or even Gemini. It has sources at the bottom, but how often do you actually go to those sources? I certainly very rarely do. So I think we need to kind of rethink how we deliver our journalism, and we're still playing with this. I think there will be more focus on live interactions with journalists. I think people will even though computers are much better at playing chess than any human now, we still like playing chess against other humans. So I think in a world of AI, you will have trusted sources or trusted guides to what's going on in the world, and you will trust them, and maybe it's people you've heard on a podcast, maybe it's people who you've got to know through videos. You will want to interact with those people. So we're thinking about how can that be sort of through live events, through digital events, through live journalism, through podcasts. Podcasts have been a sort of tremendous success for us, and I'm not sure it's one that I would have predicted, but they are. We've I think really successfully reinvented what The Economist is in podcast form. So we're sort of thinking about how you do that in other mediums. So this is all a work in progress. There'll be lots of, hopefully in the next couple of years, lots of things that we'll experiment with and that will come out. But I'm pretty sure that in 5 years' time, the media landscape will look quite different. And I'm sure you all ingest information differently to your parents, and I think that's just going to continue. So we need to make sure that we're figuring out how to reach the next generation of audiences.
Definitely, and I think it's just like how you're talking about the human element. Like it's important to have the human element when AI is so prevalent, and that's sort of what will shape the media landscape in the future. So
it's interesting that you think that. I mean, that's definitely my prior, and I've been struck by how people. We've only just this year launched short form vertical videos, but now there's a carousel on the app. You still can't share them. All of this stuff is still to come in the next few months. But we're already seeing, certain people are having a tremendous following, and people, when we make it easy to interact with them, there will be then, I think, a kind of, the notion of what you trust will change, and you will have a trusted relationship with, I hope, with the brand, and then with people who are with that brand.
Definitely, and Zanny, if you don't have anything to add on, we'll move on to sort of more general economics questions. Yeah. So, obviously you have a lot of experience with emerging markets with your time in Economist and also International Monetary Fund. And so, since you've involved your emerging markets, I'd just like to ask, how do you see the evolution of emerging markets, and have they met your expectations? Have they outperformed, underperformed, etc.?
That's a very good question. So my first kind of real job was to work in the Ministry of Finance in Poland in 1991, which was just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it was for the first solidarity post-communist government in Poland. And it was literally when the quote-unquote shock therapy started, prices were freed, and I saw what happened when free markets were able to work. And then I went to the IMF and I worked on Africa and the Soviet Union, and then the Economist. And so it was the kind of emerging market boom of the 1990s. And then there was the bust of the 1997-98 financial crisis, then the boom again in the 2000s, then the global financial crisis. And so it's been sort of like that. But I think the big picture lessons are sort of threefold. One, the scale of global poverty reduction that has occurred over the past 3 decades is pretty dramatic. It's overwhelmingly been in China, of course, but it's been pretty remarkable. So and now you see my Economist priors here, but I think that the era of globalization was broadly extremely good for poverty reduction and for development. I happen to believe that free markets and multilateral rules-based system is very the best basis for broad prosperity. It's not enough, but it's the best basis. And so I think that, but I think that since 2015, 2016, that world has been unraveling, and it's partly because of the American shift, in particular, towards tariffs, protectionism away from multilateralism, partly because everybody else is copying it, partly COVID and the very large shift to a larger state that came after that, and the kind of focus on resilience and supply chains. But I think we are unraveling a sort of global infrastructure that was extremely good for poverty reduction and extremely good for emerging markets. So I'm, broadly, China is much bigger and very successful. India is now seeing its moment coming, but it's in a much more fragmented world. So I'm somewhat more pessimistic about what the outlook is going forward, unless you are one of the very big ones. I think now is not a great time to be a small developing country, whether you're in Africa or whether you're in Asia or frankly whether you're in Latin America. I think the world of more protectionism, the world of blocks, is not a great one for those countries. So I think it's a huge shame, and I'm not naive. There were clearly insufficient attention was focused on the losers of globalization, particularly in the advanced world. So there is no doubt that while people like me spouted the importance of trade adjustment assistance, and yes, we must look after, and there must be assistance for people who lose their jobs, insufficient attention was paid to that. And so it was very much a sort of mea culpa, but that has changed the political environment so dramatically, particularly in the US, but then as a result more broadly. We are seeing the unraveling of a system that I think was an incredible engine for poverty reduction. And so the emerging markets, it's even harder now than it was then to talk about emerging markets in the group. If you're India, you're still going to be okay, actually. But if you're a country in Africa, particularly a small country in Africa, it's just much harder than it was.
Thank you so much for that response. So my next question is something a little more specific and sort of on how the economy is used in media to advance sort of political narratives. So obviously the economy was a very big issue in the US election, and Democrats defend Biden by saying Biden inherited Trump's economy and Trump inherited Obama's and things like that. So the metrics of economic success under Trump's administration, the corresponding poor performance under Biden's, were technically both a result of their predecessors' policies, with the time lag between policy implementation and effect causing this. So what do you think about this, and do you think there's any truth to that?
So I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, I think that the degree of partisanship and polarization in the US is such that people's view of the economy depends on what their political priors are. So if you are a Republican and President Trump is in charge, you think the economy is doing great. And if you are a Democrat and Biden is in charge broadly, you think that the economy is doing better. And so there's a weird causality that goes from your political priors to your beliefs about the economy. But secondly, I think one of the things we've learned in this election, I actually don't think it was all about economics, but I agree with you that economics was part of it. I think we've learned that people really care about nominal price levels as much or more than they do about real income gains. Because if it is true that the US economy has been doing much better than its peers, and that actually, over the whole period of the Biden administration, real wages didn't fall. Basically, they were rising. They rose massively during COVID because there was a huge amount of stimulus. And then they were hit by the burst of inflation after COVID. And the net is that they're up, but not by a huge amount. The problem is that people, I think, people are really angry about inflation and really angry about price levels. And I think it's the kind of, the whole argument about the price of eggs, people couldn't get over the price of eggs. But I have the same reaction. I go to New York, And I go to a Pret-a-Manger in New York, and it costs me $30 to get my lunch. And I'm just incensed by that. It's ridiculously expensive. And I don't think about, oh, where's my real, what's my real wage over that period. I'm just furious about the fact that it costs $30 to get a lunch. And I think that's it's the kind of counter to the Economist in me, because really, of course, what matters should matter is your real income. But actually, nominal levels have a kind of weird anchoring impact, I think, on people's psychology. And so your cost that you're having to pay in level terms so much. So once you've had a serious bout of inflation like that, and don't forget, this is never in my lifetime, in my adult lifetime, we hadn't had inflation like that, and certainly not any of yours. I mean, this was a huge shock to have double-digit inflation. And so even when the rate of inflation comes down, the level is obviously, ipso facto, still high. And that level thing, I think there's going to be papers written about this, the importance of nominal price levels. I think it mattered weirdly to people in the election. There were lots and lots of debates about the price of eggs. I can't remember if the price of eggs cost $8 or whatever it was. There was just it was a level argument about the price of eggs. So that's one thing that I think we learned from that. But I also don't think it was I think immigration was a huge issue, the border, the sense of loss of control of the border, and I think cultural issues were a huge issue, whether we like it or not. The left of the Democratic Party is out of step with most of mainstream America on important cultural issues in that home.
Thank you so much for your response, Danny. And I think we've covered a lot of topics from your career to economics in general. So now I'd like to open up the floor to anyone who would like to ask questions.
All right.
So thank you so much. Oh, it's on. It's on now.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much for your talk. That was really insightful, and I particularly liked how you talked about globalization, how it alleviated global poverty. And so I'd like to touch a bit upon Trump 2.0. Do you think that Trump 2.0 will be more or less of a threat to the global liberal order in terms of globalization than his first presidency?
That is a very good question that I spend an awful lot of time thinking about, and the honest answer is no, none of us knows. I think the risk is that the consequences will be much more damaging this time around. And I think that's in part because what he's proposing is potentially more radical, but it's more because the world is already in a different place, and it is in a place where, as I laid out, I think globalization is severely weakened. The rules are severely weakened. We're already in a kind of quasi-protectionist environment. And I think, those cartoons of Wile E. Coyote going over the cliff, I think we're sort of slightly in that sense that we think we're still in a globalized world of rules and so forth, but actually it's a world where economic tools are being weaponized everywhere, from sanctions to export controls. It's a world where countries are thinking inwardly. It's a world where we've already got huge budget deficits and high debt loads. So the starting position is just more dangerous. And I think both geopolitically and economically, Trump threatened, but geopolitically because he's so transactional and doesn't believe in the value of alliances, and economically because he is a protectionist. I mean, there's one thing that Trump believes in is tariffs. He really likes tariffs, and he really thinks that trade deficits are a sign of having been a weak negotiator, and the other country is taking you for a ride. He just funny. He took out ads in the New York Times in the early 1980s complaining about the Japanese trade surplus. He's been at this for 30 years, and so he will use tariffs, I think, it's already clear he'll use them as a negotiating tool, but I don't think it's at all impossible that he will use them as a revenue raiser as well. And so I think there could be some quite serious damage to come. That said, there are elements of what he wants to do which will be growth enhancing for the US. So the deregulatory agenda, I think that the idea that Elon Musk has that he's going to cut $2 trillion every year from the budget is absurd. But I think there is a lot of deregulation that could be usefully done in the US. And the single most important driver for whether the US continues to outperform will be how quickly AI is spread through the economy, how fast AI adoption happens, and whether the US remains at the forefront of it. And if there is a kind of deregulatory agenda that accelerates that and enhances it, then actually I think you could get some real benefits to the US economy there. And in the end, the weird thing right now is that, you know, the biggest potential negative political shock for the world is the US. The biggest, you know, driver of global growth right now is also the US. And so it's sort of that we're disproportionately focused on what happens in America. Anyone, yeah? You need to wait for the microphone and to shout.
Yeah, I'll just shout for
I don't mind, whatever order, whatever, actually, let's try and get everybody.
Thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed it. I particularly enjoy the Economist's emerging market sort of material. For example, like the Modi Raj podcast and what the magazine said about Javier Milei in Argentina. I wanted to ask specifically, are there any particular emerging markets that you're more bearish on and some that you're more bullish on? And I have another question as well. Sorry. It's I really like how The Economist has a really pronounced opinion. For example, they have a tradition of endorsing political candidates from like Ronald Reagan to Kamala. And I wanted to ask, is that something that you're particularly proud of, or do you think it has potential drawbacks as well?
Thank you, both very good questions. So on emerging markets, I am just sort of at a very superficial level. I think China's got real problems right now. I mean, I do think that there is a classic property bust debt overhang that has not been dealt with, and we sort of, I don't want to, the parallels aren't perfect, but we saw in Japan that it took 2 decades to get through this. And medium-term demographics aren't so great in China. So China's, it's the world's second biggest economy, it's going to be okay, but I think it's a pretty difficult time there right now. I would be a little uneasy if I were in Mexico right now, just because we don't know quite what Trump is going to do. Argentina is really interesting. I mean, the interview with Milei was there. He thought we were a socialist magazine, which I thought was quite funny. But it was quite refreshing, right? If you haven't listened to it already, it's worth it. I mean, he is an absolute sort of free market, genuine, unadulterated free market zealot. And it's sort of really refreshing to hear that. And what's really interesting is that the Trumpies love him, but actually he's not. There are important differences between Milei and Trump. Milei is not a protectionist. So I found that interview really interesting, and I also think it's pretty remarkable what he's done. I mean, he's managed to cut spending really dramatically in real terms. So Argentina has been in so much trouble for so long, maybe you can't easily do that elsewhere, but it's really, really interesting. The rest of Latin America is sort of sliding into there's not too many obvious reasons for cheer there. And it's very, very hard to. India, I think, has a huge potential if it depends on the kind of policy agenda. But basically, a very large domestic market, an incredible tech stack that leads to the possibility of serious efficiencies and tech-savvy population, massive infrastructure investment, the creation of a single market for the first time. All that I think bodes very well for India. When I'm going to Africa, there are countries that I think have real potential but suffer huge debt loads. Kenya, for example. There are also large swaths of the continent that are just, have real challenges that go well beyond the economic. I mean, the kind of degree to which the Sahel is sort of, essentially becoming a series of quasi-parent states is really alarming. So I guess a big ones that I'm most upbeat about India, and these aren't really emerging markets, but the Gulf. The transformation in Saudi Arabia is real and serious and amazing. And they're going to waste a huge amount of money on crazy projects, but actually there's also a very serious social transformation going on there, so I'm upbeat about that. And medium term, I think Mexico has huge potential because it's right next to America, but it's going to be a bit rocky for the next couple of years, I think. What was your other question about the Economist and endorsements? So it's interesting because I got asked this question a lot actually after the Washington Post decided not to make an endorsement this year. I happened to be in America doing a bunch of TV. And my answer was that for, as you say, we are an opinionated newspaper. In fact, one of my predecessors called us a views paper, which is quite a good phrase. But since we opine every week and we are constantly telling politicians, what to do on policy areas around the world, it seems to me it would be bizarre not to then offer a view on which potential political leader offered the best prospects. Now, we don't do endorsements for every country because that would be impossible, but these under my leadership, we've done France, we've done India, we've done South Africa, we've done Britain, and we've done the US. So I was never in any doubt that we would endorse. Although I have to say, I was not looking forward to what the decision would be if Joe Biden had stayed in the race. That was going to just a very, very unfortunate one. Because I do think he was visibly declining, he was too old and should not have run again. But this particular endorsement, as you will know if you read it, was very much an argument about the risks, the tail risks of Donald Trump. It was not a strong endorsement of Kamala Harris, who I thought was, for lots of reasons, a very, very weak candidate, and who I would have been surprised if she would have made a great president, but I thought the downside risks were smaller.
Yeah, so thanks so much for the talk. I had two questions. The first was, what are the range of sources that you cultivate as an economic journalist or financial journalist? And the second was, The Economist is clearly a really influential magazine. Were there moments in your career where you were like, wow, really powerful people read our publications? And what stood out to you?
So on the first one, it sort of depends what you're specializing in, right? What your beat is, what your sources are. So let me give you some examples from my own career. So when I first got to Washington, I was writing about the US economy and US sort of economic policy. So I was in Washington, so I made it my business to get to know everybody, obviously all the relevant think tanks, and Washington's full of them, key academics who were sort of policy focused, and then people in the Fed, people in the Treasury, and the good thing about, because The Economist isn't about so much about kind of daily news and it isn't about scoops, you can develop, you can get to know people, you can have lots of off-the-record conversations, you can have people who will then sort of engage with you, not quite as a peer, but sort of as a peer, so you can have discussions and debates. And so I ended up spending 18 years in Washington, so I really got to know people quite well, and I'm in touch with lots of them. So it was a process over time of winning people's trust, developing, hopefully getting some respect from them as an interlocutor and just sort of as a sort of part of the policy discussion. And so for me, that was kind of what and then when for a while I wrote about academic economics, and I did the same thing. I just made it my business to, really try and keep abreast of not just reading the papers, but actually, going to departments, getting to know who were the kind of interesting economists doing. I mean, it's hard for us to write about some really esoteric theory, but who were doing the more sort of policy-focused and real-world-focused things. If you're my colleague who's the economics correspondent in India, it's even more important to know who are people with whom you could discuss what's going on, who could tell you what's happening. It's not so much a kind of journalistic idea of I need sources to tell me scoops. It's that I need to have people who can help explain to me what's going on. That was and you had a second question too?
Yeah, I was wondering, were there moments in your
Oh,
career?
yes. Well, I thought, yes, all the time. I mean, I still think that. I still, people, I guess now they just say it's flattery, I don't know, but people really do seem to read The Economist, and so pretty much whenever I go and see someone, however, grand and important they are, they would have read The Economist. Although Donald Trump, whom I've only met once, did not pretend to read it, although he said, you'll write something nasty, but make sure the picture's good. It's amazing how many people read it. It's amazing how many people take it seriously, and I get, texts and emails from all kinds of people who will take issue with something or like something, and yeah, it's sort of striking So I'll give you an example, which is not an economic example, but I got, and that never gets old, by the way. You still can't quite believe all these people actually reading this stuff. But I did, a few months ago, I made a podcast. We have this weekend podcast called Weekend Intelligence, which is a sort of 50-minute narrative podcast. And I made one on Gaza. And I went and I spent a week in Israel. I went into Gaza and I was in the West Bank. Because I was just really, I am not a Middle East expert at all. At least I now know a reason about it because I spent a lot of the last year thinking about it and talking to people. But I wasn't. It hasn't been the focus of my career. And I decided that I really wanted to sort of understand what would happen next there and talk to people on both sides and really try to do a deep dive. So I did this, and I have a fantastic producer with whom I did it, and with two of my colleagues, one from Dubai and one from Jerusalem. And we made this podcast, and it's a very tough subject, you know, on which people have very, understandably, very strong views. And I got two texts, one from a very senior Palestinian and one from a very senior Israeli, both of whom said they really liked it. And I thought, okay, right, that's all I really need. Then I feel good about this piece of work. And that kind of response never gets old. When people who, and I don't actually care only or even mainly about the kind of important people. I care also a lot about ordinary subscribers and ordinary. And there's one other thing which, if you didn't see it, was perhaps the most, probably the single most moving thing I've had recently, actually in my whole tenure in this job. I got a letter earlier this year, which we published in September, from an Iranian American, who had been imprisoned in an Evin prison. He was a political prisoner, and he'd been there for 7 years, I think. And he wrote me a letter saying that he had managed to get copies of The Economist into prison, and there was a kind of samizdat run of people who read The Economist, and even when the guards confiscated it, they managed to get it back, and that he wanted to apologize for the fact that this group of people hadn't paid the subscription for many years, but to alert me to the fact that how important The Economist had been in these dark days for him and his fellow prisoners. And I just thought, my God, if there's anything that makes this worthwhile, it's something like that. We published it in the middle of September. It was an incredibly moving letter. So that's those kinds of people, or when young people come up to me and say they've read something, and people sometimes do. I get some people saying, I read The Economist and it made me change my career to become something else, I read an article. There was a scientist actually, so they read an article in the science section and it made them change the focus of their research. It's like, wow, this is an amazing. It's amazing as a journalist to have that.
You answer your question.
Thank you for sharing. I just want to ask you about authoritarian capitalism, because obviously you said you believe in free markets, but there will be countries, for example, Singapore or China, that are doing quite well as well. And even more specifically, maybe for emerging markets, how do you think? Do you think authoritarian capitalism is probably a better way, or do you still believe in free markets?
So I think you know my answer. I also think there's a big, big difference between Singapore and China. So one is it would be nice if they had a little bit more freedom of the press, and the other one is, kind of extremely in the other direction. I don't buy the idea, and we've been doing some work trying to look into this quantitatively, but for me, it's a very sort of seductive argument, right? Look at countries that are successful, Korea didn't become a democracy until the 1990s, that a little bit of authoritarianism is kind of important to get you on the road to development. That's the argument. My concern about that is that I happen to believe that individual liberty is a good in its own right. I don't think it's a purely instrumental good in whether it does or does not make prosperity faster. And so I think a country like China has had a bargain, right? A social contract which has been, you will become more prosperous, but the regime is an authoritarian regime, to stay that way. The problem with that is that right now, China is not becoming more prosperous fast enough, and for younger Chinese, there is that element of the bargain isn't being held up, so I think you're storing up problems there. Am I sort of wide-eyed about, democracy is in itself an answer and everything will be fine? No, I mean, the promise of what happened in the Middle East in the last 10 years has shown that, it's not a sufficient condition for prosperity, but for me, the evolution of economic reform and political freedom are both important things, and I wouldn't want to kind of permanently sacrifice one in pursuit of the other. Are there successful countries that are not, on the kind of Singapore end of the spectrum? Of course there are, and you can have models that do that, and that's okay. But my own personal view is that political freedom is an important value in itself.
Someone from the back.
Am I waiting for the mic or?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming down to talk to us. I was just wondering, in view of the rise of economic populism across the world, what do you think should be the role of media in bridging the gap between what the common person thinks is the state of the economy and what is actually happening?
So I think I don't think one can think of the media as one monolith. And I think what you will always have sort of populist media that is, you've always had it, even before social media created more silos. And you will always have more, mainstream or serious media. And, the hope should be that you have kind of trusted sources. They don't need to necessarily be traditional media, but trusted sources. And that you can therefore find a kind of, a common understanding of what is the truth. And what worries me at the moment, particularly about the United States, is not that you have different views. You've always had different views, and you've got fragmentation of opinion, but that actually people don't agree on a common fact base. So when I go to America, I force myself to watch cable news in the morning and cable news in the evening for about 15 minutes when I'm brushing my teeth usually, and it's when I brush my teeth for 15 minutes, but you know what I mean. And it's if I watch MSNBC in the morning, I'll watch Fox in the evening or vice versa. And it's not a pleasant experience, but what's telling is you really think you're in a different country. It's just a completely different description of what is going on in the country. So it's totally different facts. And that I think is alarming. And I think the interesting thing in the UK is that we have massive fragmentation of media. We have many of the same things. But weirdly, despite its sort of, everyone loves to kick it, the BBC provides I think, a sort of broadly common fact base that has prevented that scale of fragmentation. And that's what worries me about where we are right now in the US. And one of the most interesting things that's happened in this election actually has been the rise of completely non-traditional media, independent podcasters, as a vehicle as a sort of tool of political campaigns, but also an insight into candidates, which actually I think has been quite useful. And I don't know how many of you listened to Donald Trump on Joe Rogan, but I found it fascinating. I listened to the whole thing. It was really, really interesting, and I learned a lot about him. And Kamala Harris on Call Me Daddy, which my daughter listens to Call Me Daddy regularly. It was not an obvious thing for me to listen to, but actually that was interesting too. So I don't think the traditional mainstream media has a monopoly on this at all. You can have interesting insights into where the world is going from lots of different sources, but the real problem is when you're so silent that you can't even agree on what the facts are, and that I think is worrying.
I want to ask about the covers of the Economist and like their power. I think most people who don't even read the Economist or like any economics journals see the covers and like have opinions on that. What do you think of the influence of your covers?
They do, they get very cross about them too, or they like it as well. It's funny actually, they're sort of very iconic, our covers. So even, people who never see the physical Economist. So we spend a lot of time on the covers. I spend a lot of time with we have brilliant cover designers, thinking about, how we're going to, we don't know what we want to have the big journalistic take that week, but what is the cover treatment going to be? What's it going to, how we're going to do it? And we have there's a lot of debate about it. A lot of attention. And then sometimes there's not, again, we don't always agree. So this week, I don't know if you've seen this week's cover. I think it's funny. I'm sure lots of people in France will be cross about it. But I thought it mixed, sophisticated, evoking sophisticated scenes of Paris with really childish English humour. So I thought it was very funny, but it was one of those ones which I'm sure will have lots of cross-stretch. The Italians got extremely cross when we had the picture of Liz Truss's Britannia with the pizza she was. So people get very angry about them. I like humorous ones. I think when the work, we can't do humorous ones every week because that would be silly, but I like doing them more often than not because I sometimes think that when there is when the subject is very serious, it's actually quite important to have some humor in it. And one of the criticisms I often get is that our humor is at the expense of cultural stereotyping, national stereotyping. And it's true, it often is. But that's because actually stereotypes that's what they are. They are sort of widely understood humorous ways of so I do it, I'm trying to be aware of that. And sometimes I send the right covers around to get looked at by a lot of people, just to make sure that there isn't something we've missed. I don't mind offending people, but I want to know that I've offended them. I don't want to inadvertently offend people, so I want to be kind of clear about what the potential reaction might be to a cover.
Do you need a mic?
No, not really. I wanted to ask something regarding your experience at the IMF. Because clearly, development finance is in many respects a multilateral pursuit. So now with a more fragmented world, and now that developmental institutions are not exclusively associated with Western powers, how do you see development finance changing in the next couple of years?
That is a very good question, which to which my IMF experience has relatively little relevance because it was so long ago. But when I was at the IMF, it was, the stereotype was that it was the Washington consensus enforcer, the arrogant bunch of people who turned up and said, here's, deregulate, cut your budget deficit. And there was quite a lot of truth to that, actually. Now, I think both the prevailing orthodoxy of the fund has changed, but more important, as you say, in a fragmenting world, the power of the fund and the impact of the fund and the room for maneuver has shifted. And part of the problem is the growing reliance of lots of economists on China for loans and massive building up of the debt stock. So part of the debt challenge is in Africa because lots of countries have borrowed a lot from China. Part of it is that the IMF is massively exposed to a small number of countries, Argentina being, it's too big to fail, Argentina. The IMF would be almost out of business if Argentina didn't fail that. So I think there's been a kind of slight mission creep. The fund, in looking for relevance in this world, has become very focused on climate and very focused on all manner of things, which I'm not necessarily sure that a bunch of macroeconomists are best placed to do. So I think this is some fantastic work done at the IMF, but I think you're right that it is an institution that is, it's not quite clear what its role is in a fragmented world. It's a victim of the sort of fragmentation of the post-World War world.
Last question, anyone?
curious about your view on your own education. So, were there any particular moments where you look back and you think that really shaped my thoughts, my ambitions, or my skill set? And also, what advice would you give to an undergraduate who wants to become a justice for a successful career?
Gosh, lots of questions there, and that's a good one to end on. So I didn't benefit from an LSE education. I would have probably been more quantitative had I done so. I did PPE, the world's, slightly looked down on degree now. And then I went to the US. And I really liked, and I was lucky enough to go to the US, and I think I benefited from the rigor of a British undergraduate education, and then the kind of horizon opener at that point of being in the US. I think the sort of single life-changing experience was when I first went to Poland for this summer internship, which was complete luck that I managed to get onto that. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do in the summer, and a friend of mine said, "Oh, Jeff Sachs is looking for interns to take," and Jeff Sachs wasn't even my professor, but I went to his office hours, and essentially he said, "What would you bring to this internship program?" And I sort of blagged my way on it by saying, "Well, I speak Russian and German, and Polish is halfway between." And he said, "Well, do you know anything about agriculture?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I grew up on a farm," which is also true. Because he was looking for somebody to work on the agricultural sector. So it was complete luck that I got this internship. And that was probably the single, and then I took a semester off and I worked there for a while. So and from that, I kind of take one thing, and I say this to everyone who asks me, and I really believe it. I think the single best thing that I've always tried to do, and the advice that I can give, is just grab opportunities when they come. Seek them out and grab them. And I have genuinely only regretted things I said no to. I have regretted not doing things. I have not regretted professionally any move that I've made. And I think that that's getting the most different kinds of experiences that you can have. And I think it's and my kids are your age. I think it's very easy to feel I must do X and I must do Y, and then I've got to go and, there's a career trajectory laid out for me. I can't afford to go and take that summer off and do something, go and do this sort of weird internship somewhere, or I can't. And do those different experiences, things that may be outside your immediate comfort zone. Because now's the time to try all of those things. And I don't think you'll regret anything that is a sort of professional long shot, or trying something, or the internship that you might not even have thought about, the opportunity that you might have thought about, the working, or something that is out of the main trajectory. I think I think particularly when the world is changing so fast, having different experiences from different things, and I'll end with this, the one thing that it turned out all right in the end, but if I had my time again, I might have tried to fit in spending a couple of years working in the proper private sector. I don't really count journalism, I don't know, in finance or in something, having a sense, because I went graduate school to the IMF. The IMF is fantastic. I learned a huge amount there, but it's a public sector bureaucracy. It's quite academic, and it's a public sector bureaucracy. Then I became a journalist. I've never really worked in a kind of real, I don't know, whatever, a bank or a financial institution, or or even a kind of real company, a startup, a tech startup. I mean, I think, and I think that getting some experience like that would be really, it would have been a great thing to do. And I think that the corollary of that is don't turn down it. And you'll all have potentially so many, you're going to have such a long working life. You've got so much chance to try different things. But that's what I would, and I also think it's a fantastic opportunity now that you can, it's such an exciting world. I mean, the world is like, I don't need me to tell you this, the pace of change, technology in every aspect is so dramatic that, in 20 years, the whole idea of a working environment will be completely different. There'll be completely different technologies, everything will be completely different. So there's so much potential that you have, and the upside of, the world is changing in sort of somewhat sobering ways that we've talked about, but the upside is there's so much energy in places like Asia, the Middle East, in parts of Africa. I was in Kenya twice this year, and the number of people of your age who are doing unbelievably interesting things in Nairobi, who often just come there for a few months, they're doing something different. There's an energy and a kind of, the place is changing. But I think that grabbing the most, making the most of the skills and the great degree that you will have to go and try different things is what I will focus on. Thank you for having me.